afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Thaneshwar Bhusal. I am kind of professional working at the Ministry of Labor, Employment and Social Security in Nepal. I am an Honorary Professional Associate at the University of Canberra in Australia. So many of you are aware of these series that we have started talking or began to talk from last year. This year, we are focusing on many of the discourses that are in place among the federalism scholars. So today is going to be our very first conversation. We have got an expert in the area of environmental policy making, climate change, energy policy, and so on. As you can see, her name is Nidhi Srivastava. She is a law and policy consultant based in New Delhi. She has over 15 years of professional experience in legal and policy research on issues relating to environment, natural resources, energy, and climate change. She is a third-year PhD student at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And today she will be speaking about how federal and semi-federal and non-federal countries around some of the countries have been experiencing or playing with some of the environmental issues in their policy making. So Nidhi, I would like to welcome you to the conversation. It's of course our great pleasure meeting you, although it's virtual for pandemic reason. And we would like to begin some of the topics of today's conversation. Are you okay? Is there anything that you would like to highlight in the first place?
Thank you so much for your kind introduction and having me for this dialogue. I look forward to having this conversation with you.
Thank you very much. Of course, it's our pleasure too. So I would like to begin with some of the observations that the recent climate change report, if that's the right term to say, it clearly mentions that human activities are the primary causes of how or to what extent we are experiencing the negative impact of our climate. You are probably aware of many of the dimensions that the scientists have touched upon in that report. So what would be your preliminary observation about the warning the report has given to the humankind in general?
The IPCC report that has recently come out has in a way re-emphasized on the warning signals that have been raised over the past few decades. And there are obvious physical impacts of climate change, which can be seen by just looking around. The number of extreme weather events and disasters that have taken place, not just all over the world, but even if we talk just our South Asian region in the last few decades, the number of droughts, number of floods, glacial melting, landslides, avalanches, there are clear proof of this kind of climate change. And as I said, these are very obvious in our day-to-day. Sometimes we do not recognize them as, as a climate change. But I would not really delve much into these physical aspects. But I would like to flag certain other impacts of climate change that the IPCC report has implications for, and something that would be relevant for our conversation today. And these include how these kind of climate change impacts, they are going to have an effect on the challenges that are there for governance, for additional pressure that they pose on the institutions that are already in place, or they highlight the gaps that exist in terms of institutions. They also raise issues with respect to newer dimensions of geopolitics and international relations. Because with an increasing focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the existing emphasis on fossil fuels, shift from fossils towards renewables, how exactly that changes the traditional order. in a multipolar world right now, we're talking about how there are going to be newer collaborations and newer relations that are going to be forged, whether in the form of International Solar Alliance or the Brick Road Initiative. These are all newer impacts of climate change, some direct, some indirect, but are worth looking at. And especially in South Asia, as IPCC has highlighted, the number of natural hazards and disasters that have taken place in this region have been manyfold, and also with home to about a quarter of world population. South Asia, not just in terms of these physical impacts, but also as as a strategic area, South Asia cannot be ignored in terms of actions needed for climate action.
So in addition to, let's say, some of the impact on some of the geographies around the world, including in South Asia, you mentioned some of the components of governance and institutions as one of the primary causes or the space for impact. So what would be your comment on the role of political institutions or the role of the type of government, whether they are democratic or non-democratic, if you like? So what could be your comment on different types of government that are responsible to responding for this catastrophe?
The various political systems that may exist, they are very much like climate change, are also reflective of human actions. They are a result of and a reflection of human actions, because ultimately any form of political system, even an autocratic system, needs some kind of legitimacy, and that legitimacy comes from the people. Now, which political system or government system is better or better equipped at respecting environment or responding to environmental challenges? It depends on a number of factors, but one would assume that there is a greater representation and accountability in democratic systems as concerns of people, because ultimately all of these environmental impacts that we talk about are not just affecting the earth, but the inhabitants of the earth as well. While we are responsible, but we're also getting impacted by it. So, the concerns of people, including those related to environment, how they are getting reflected and addressed in the overall decision-making of a particular country, that is important. And there can be pros and cons of any system. So there is, while I say that, a democratic setup may be better suited to address or give voice to certain concerns, but there is an issue of how does one balance these democratic values or individual liberties, which can be at odds with environmental concerns. So what about rights to somebody's right to use a vehicle of one's choice or cooking fuel of one's choice, even if it is leading to greater GHG emission or pollution? So these are, some of the issues, and corresponding to that, in recent times, there has been some kind of argument in favor of authoritarian environmentalism, where governments, they do not let go of control over environmental policy decisions. It's rather top-down or non-participatory, but then it ensures that the environmental concerns are taken care of and individual rights do not come in way of those rights. So it ultimately depends on how participatory these processes are when when we're making these environmental decisions, and also the level of compliance. While one might cite examples of environmental decisions of authoritarian governments as model of more successful implementation than Western liberal democracies that have kind of disappointed us when it comes to action on climate change, we need to be mindful that its impact on diminishing checks and balances is also going to have an impact, because in environmental decision making, these checks and balances are extremely important.
Thank you. I fully agree with some of the elements that you just highlighted. For example, there is no such a benchmark that either of the political system that we just highlighted is good or bad. So it, of course, depends upon the extent to which it offers participatory opportunities to its ordinary people who do not belong to any of the organizations, but are impacted by the negative impact of the climate change, for example. So that leads me to ask a different question in relation to the environmental policy making in federal government settings. Um, uh, for my reading, it appears like the federal system is comparatively a little bit complex when it comes to making public policies compared to centralized or unitary government systems. Federal government face different problems at different levels. For example, at the federal level, the problems and circumstances appear entirely different from what can be seen at the local level. So what would be your, or what is your experience or idea in relation to how federal countries are coping with when it comes to making the environmental policies? Are they doing well? If there is any evidence from a reading, or is there any space that you can see can be improved in federal settings and so on? So I would love to listen to your expression on the question of environmental policy making in federal countries.
Right, thank you. That is very important, and I would say a question that requires a lot of discussion. But to give my views on this, I agree with you that federal systems, they are very uniquely placed, and they create both opportunities as well as challenges when it comes to environment and climate change. So, when we talk of climate change, a lot of discussion. We also started today with the IPCC report. So a lot of discussion is often on how climate change is a global problem phenomenon. It requires global action. The causes and effects are transboundary and cut across boundaries, etc. And we even celebrate announcements of international commitments and targets set by world leaders at multilateral fora. However, when we talk of these international commitments, ultimately they trickle down to lower levels. And when they are trickling down to lower levels, the implementation has to be at national level governments and at country level. And when we talk of federal systems, it becomes even more interesting, complex, and something with a lot of potential, because there is an opportunity to involve multi-level governments. Because ultimately, these are the levels, states and cities, villages, which are closer to the people, and they feel the impact of climate change more directly. So national action is, of course, important, and countries set goals for themselves for climate change mitigation and adaptation. In Paris Agreement, nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as they're more commonly known, they're at the core of the agreement. Moreover, the transboundary nature of climate change impacts and environmental problems in general, they usually make a case for strong central or federal level action. But that central or federal level action that we talk about is essential and is vital for coordination of action across different levels, act as a bridge. But we need to remember that coordination is not synonymous with concentration. And so while a certain level of government may act more in terms of coordination, it does not justify concentration of powers with that level of government. And in a federal country, it is more challenging. And when we're talking of environmental policy making or decision making, because one has to acknowledge that there is going to be vast differences in priorities and opportunities that exist. There will be some regions, provinces, or states which, for instance, have a higher renewable energy potential. They can move to cleaner fuel faster. There are states or provinces which have rich forest cover, which are agroclimatically in that zone where they can increase their forest cover and create carbon sinks. Similarly, vulnerability is also varied. Some states would, and regions, and even cities for that matter, would be at a higher risk. And those may not necessarily be just because of geographic conditions, but socioeconomic, demographic, institutional, etc. Where, for instance, if it's a coastal state and a large population is dependent on fisheries. So, these kinds of impacts are going to be different for different states and regions or provinces when we talk of climate-induced disasters.
That's true. That also indicates, Nidhi, that local governments are the ones who have to face the immediate challenges or problems posed by the changing climate. So, in your opinion, how can local governments be empowered or equipped with resources to launch sometimes adaptive, other times mitigative programs? So, of course, it depends upon the extent to which they have the local governments have been given power by the central or federal governments.
Right.
But what are the, let's say, immediate program of action, whether that's adaptive or mitigative, you can foresee to be implemented in local government arena?
The kind of policy making that usually exists in a federal system, even in a successful federal model, I would say, it usually stops at the level of states. So when we talk of subnational governments, we often think of center or the federal government and the state governments. But as you said, that most of the impacts are felt at the local or rural level. And that area is still quite marginal in addressing climate change discussion. And when we talk of local governments, it is estimated that cities account for more than 70% of GHG emissions, mostly from transport, other sectors like buildings, etc. And since this is the level at which a lot of impacts are being felt, it is natural that action is needed for including these jurisdictions in climate change and environment policy decision making. It's important that local governments play an important role in implementing mitigation and adaptation plans, but also in designing those. And over the recent years, if we look at the Conference of Parties in recent times, there is a greater involvement and participation of cities. There's a greater presence of local governments and events at panels around UNFCCC. So, because of the proximity of the problems, local problems, knowledge and better understanding of capacity that is there of these local governments, they are well suited not only for just implementing programs that are set and designed by the national government or say the state governments, but also in terms of prioritizing their climate action. However, we see that the capacity is often limited, and that is where cooperative action is needed. There is a lot to learn from experiences of other jurisdictions and benefits from and benefit from the know-how and resources that are available with other levels of government. There are examples where cities have been a little more proactive in taking action with respect to climate change mitigation and adaptation, with support from both national or state level governments as well as international agencies, workshops, trainings, frameworks, evaluation tools, reporting tools. These are the ways in which local government can be supported to become independent in their environmental decisions as well as implementation of this. And as I mentioned, to this effect, some international initiatives are also there. There is Cities Alliance support. Then there is the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, where a lot of South Asian cities are also a part of. And they've been involving cities, helping cities in reporting and planning for city level climate leadership, and making sure that as the pace of urbanization is quite rapid in all over the world and in this region including, that there is integration of climate change with urban planning in general. And climate change is not an afterthought. So this is an opportunity to plan early and include it in the systems. And we talk of climate resilient city action plans, but also other enabling factors like, setting up institutions for it, having a local buy-in, and recognizing climate change in municipal budgets, because that also would help in making these local governments self-sufficient and be able to implement and design climate resilient plans and policies.
Yeah, absolutely. So you brought some of the topics in regards to the intergovernmental relations when it comes to the role of local governments in environmental policy making, or encouraging citizens to participate in the making of local public policies that are centered around the environmental protection and other things. So if you sit down near the local government and see upwards in a federal country, you will see either provincial or state government there, and then federal or central government from above there. Above the federal government, as you also highlighted in your previous conversation, that there are international actors, including the IPCC, UNFCCC, and other organizations are also there. So it clearly indicates that there is a notion of coordination, vertically speaking, and there is also a notion of horizontal coordination among its communities, ordinary people's organizations, interest groups, and lobbying groups. So that clearly indicates, Nidhi, in federal country, the complexity is really deeper and deeper. But the policymakers are, or have been consistently for centuries, to minimize such complexities and produce desirable policies. So what would be your recommendations for federal countries or policymakers in federal countries to balance this horizontal and vertical notion of coordination and collaboration in making sure that environmental policies are perfectly framed, and after they are framed, they are absolutely or actually implemented at the local level? I would love to listen to your recommendations in this particular part.
You've summarized it very well, the issue of horizontal and vertical coordination and cooperation that is needed. When we talk of cooperation and collaboration in federal systems, we usually see that the federal government, it depends on the state or local governments to take up the responsibility of carrying out certain required activities, which are often decided by a higher level of government. And whereas the state governments and the local governments, they depend on federal governments and state governments for institutional and financial support to perform the activities. Because there is a mismatch when we talk of, in terms of capacity that exists and the responsibility that is on different levels of government. So when we talk of state or local levels of government, the responsibility that they have in terms of delivering on climate change related policies, it is not always commensurate with the kind of resources they have, or the kind of capacity they have, both technical as well as fiscal capacity. And that is where I feel that intergovernmental fiscal transfers play a very important role. But that is something I'll talk about in a bit. But coming back to your question of vertical and horizontal level of coordination, it is extremely important that governments and institutions at the same level they talk and interact. And that is where there is a lot of scope in terms of sharing of best practices. While in terms of vertical coordination that we talk about, we can share responsibilities, we can share resources, but in terms of horizontal coordination or cooperation that we talk about, it is very important, because it fills the information gap that exists. And that information gap does not always come from a higher up jurisdiction or a higher level of government. It quite often comes from our peers. And when one state learns from another state, or one city learns from another city, there is much more of learning. So those kind of horizontal, interministerial, intercity, interstate kind of mechanisms, that is something that is very important. Now, I was talking about the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, for instance. That is just to give an example of an institutional mechanism that exists to promote this kind of cooperation, to address the kind of differences that exist in terms of resources. In most constitutions, in most countries, we'll see that fiscal transfers, bodies, or fiscal transfers themselves are provided for in the constitution itself. So that gives certain kind of greater legitimacy to it, and it keeps these institutions autonomous and allows them to be fair. So that adds to its value. But having said that, constitutional mandate is not sufficient for success of an institution, because there are several examples. I'll just take another example of an Indian institution, the Interstate Council Secretariat in India, which had, again, the constitutional mandate, but which has not been as successful or impactful when it comes to center-state relations or interstate relations.
Here in Nepal, we also have a very fresh constitution that outlines Nepal's government as a federal country, a federal government. And as you also indicated, that the provincial governments and local governments are constitutionally empowered to formulate certain public policies at provincial and local level. You are right that, of course, this constitutional mandate can be instrumental at some point in time, but not always as effective as we expect it to be effective. Coming back to my question of horizontal coordination, it links, because I am also a scholar of the participatory governance. I like to link this horizontal notion of environmental policy making with the participatory aspect of policy making. So what happens generally, if I take the case from Nepal as well, is that local governments tend to bring as much ordinary citizens as they can. But eventually what it happens is that these ordinary people may not have sufficient knowledge and expertise, for example, in providing information to make policies for adaptation programs or projects, or policies that would influence mitigative approaches to policy making. So coming back to the point of horizontal coordination and constitutionalism, federalism, and other things, what would be your prescription to policymakers in countries like Nepal, who can actually empower ordinary people in the making of local environmental policies, so that the notion of horizontal coordination can be enriched a little bit more?
Right. There are various ways in which this kind of involving citizens in horizontal coordination can be encouraged and increased. And there are, more so because climate change itself is cross-cutting. It runs across so many different sectors, whether it is energy, agriculture, land use, and so on and so forth. So because it is such an overarching subject, citizens have the potential and opportunity to use a variety of tools, for influencing and participating in environmental decision making. And in this region, again, we've seen certain kinds of formal as well as informal mechanisms where this kind of citizen participation has been instrumental. And one of the most direct and visible ways or examples has been in terms of approaching the judiciary. If we look at the past few decades, courts in India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all around have really expanded the notion of locus standi and allowed citizens to come and seek interventions from courts for protecting their rights. So whether it's the famous Ashkar Lekari case from Pakistan, where a Pakistani farmer could approach the court and ask the government to take action and implement their national climate change policy, or it was a resident of Kathmandu, Mr. Shrestha, who approached and asked for the government to formulate an act for climate change. In India, it was a 9-year-old child who approached the court and raised the point that climate change affects children disproportionately because there are certain vulnerable groups. So highlighting those. So there are instances where common people have been influencing the environmental policy discourse. There are more formal instruments and ways in which public are involved. For instance, public hearing requirements in environment impact assessments. Now, that is something that has been there for several years. But if you look at the experience, we see that you talked about how local governments can include and involve people in a more meaningful manner. But we often see that quite often those local governments themselves dilute those provisions for public participation and public hearing, etc. So, it is a mixed bag. There are provisions available, there are opportunities, but to what extent are they being used to involve people is something that has had not a great I would say, experience. Although there have been cases, for instance, in Odisha, in India, the Niyamgiri forest case, it's a very famous one where indigenous communities, they were able to assert their rights against big multinational mining companies. And, they safeguarded their forests, which they had been protecting for ages. Similarly, Nepal has a long history of community forestry. So, there are these different forms of community participation for natural resources that are there. And at a more informal level, I'd say there are, ways, especially in this day and age of internet, we see that citizens are able to respond to environmental policy making more actively. I'll just give you one quick example that in the middle of pandemic last year, the Indian government, it came up with a draft revision of the environment impact assessment laws. And despite the pandemic, around 17 lakh submissions were made to the government, opposing it. And there was this widespread opposition against it. And ultimately the government had to pull back the draft and put it for consultation, etc. So there are different ways in which people can be involved in a better way. But ultimately, if we want it to be meaningful, the governments themselves have to cooperate with that, because often we see that the government comes in defensive mode and is not really able to respond to the concerns or questions that the citizens raise.
Absolutely, Nidhi. Thank you very much. My final question for today's conversation would be in regards to funding in the environmental policy and programs. On one hand, many of the developing countries or those countries who are comparatively more vulnerable than others to climate change, have been consistently saying that there is a less commitment from the international community for the funding of the programs that they want to be implemented in their communities. Whereas on the other hand, the international community who keeps on funding to those developing countries or vulnerable countries say that the funding is there. There is a high or huge volume of funding already available to those countries, but there is a capacity of developing countries that limits the spending or expenditure of such funding in proper, appropriate manner. So what would be your prescription to balance such a striking notion of funding? Is there any evidence that you have gathered or any suggestion?
Funding for climate action is definitely important, and I'll just quote UN Environment Program, which estimates that over the next few years, by 2030, $300 billion per year would be needed by developing countries to address climate change concerns. And this is again going to be a very important issue, climate change finance and funding at the 26th COP of UNFCCC that is going to be held in early November and October. I agree that, there are issues with respect to utilization and effective and impactful spending of, the aid that comes in for climate change. I feel that there are, certain issues that need to be addressed and, looked at when designing these kind of transfers, and also in from the recipient side as well, because it's important to identify the issues correctly. And if you look at the funding, more than 70% of the funding goes for mitigation measures, right? When countries are reeling under the pressure of adaptation, the ones that are in need of these finances. So where is the funding going would also determine how well it is being utilized. Then the identification of the suitable level of receiving those funds is again important, because national or federal funds may be better suited at something, for instance, setting ambitions, monitoring, guidance, etc. But if we expect the national government to do the implementation, it may not work that well. More local funds or subnational funds would be better suited for micro planning or design and delivery. So, that is important. Thirdly, I feel sustainability and ownership of these, finances is again important. At some point, the international cooperation or even private sector funding, they might exit. Or what happens then? So, for instance, in Kenya, there were country climate change, the county climate change funds, which were set up with the assistance of international donor agencies. But gradually, they were incorporated in the county's budgets, so that there is a flow, and it continues to be there, it's included in the budget. So, these are some of the things that need to be kept in mind. Personally, I find this capacity argument a bit paradoxical, because lack of capacity itself needs support to strengthen capacity, right? And it should not be made an excuse for not transferring powers or funds, whatever. But unfortunately, this is something that one sees within countries too. Federal governments, they cite lack of capacity of subnational governments, for not devolving either funds or powers, or not being able to relinquish control over resources. So yeah, it is the same what we see in terms of international to a country level relationship that we see between the central and subnational.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nidhi Srivastava, for your time and contribution to this conversation. I remember a very famous quote from Carol Patman, who is a very, very famous political scientist who writes mostly on democracy and democratic theories. She says, ordinary citizens must be given chances to participate in the making of local policies or any other policies that affect them. So when it comes to the capacity paradox that you just mentioned, many of the advanced countries keep on saying that, well, developing countries may not have capacities. If we follow Carol Patman's argument saying that, well, we should allow them so that they would be trained to be able to implement the programs or to spend the money that is given to them. So anyway, thank you very much once again. We touched upon at least 8 different topics within this federalism climate change discourse. They include governance, institutions, decision-making processes, the role of federal, provincial, and local governments, participatory aspects, intergovernmental fiscal transfer, and other things related to funding, and so on. Thanks a lot once again from my personal side as well as from the organizer's side. Dear audiences, we will be continuing our discourses, our conversation surrounding federalism discourses in next few weeks, focusing on, but not limited to, for example, resource distribution, capacity development, intergovernmental transfer, and other related issues.